On the 8th of June 1990, a schoolteacher named Selena Lovell stood on a beach at Sandy Cape, on what is now called K'gari, and watched something impossible drag itself toward the shore. She stayed there for half an hour, at one point standing only 5 feet away from it, before it turned back toward the water, tossed several fish into the air, and vanished into the deeper ocean. She was not alone. 6 other people signed their names to a document confirming they had seen the exact same thing that same day. A 7th witness, a young Aboriginal boy, had reportedly seen it days earlier. More than a century later, nobody has ever offered a fully convincing explanation for what any of them actually saw. Sandy Cape sits at the northern tip of what was then called Great Sandy Island, now known by its traditional name K'gari, off the Queensland coast. Lovell's account of what happened there was detailed and specific. She described a creature roughly 30 feet long, built around an enormous dome-shaped body, approximately 8 feet wide and 5 feet high, connected to a long, extended neck ending in a face she described as distinctly reptilian, fitted with teeth or serrated jawbones measuring around 18 inches in length. Its skin was smooth and glossy, greenish-white along the head and neck, marked with pale spots, with a single black eye ringed in white. Behind the dome shell trailed a tail nearly 12 feet long, described as silver fading to white, covered in scales roughly the size of a thumbnail, laid out perpendicular to the tail itself, arranged, in her own words, like the tiles on a roof. Lovell's account did not stand alone. A signed document survives from the sighting itself, listing James Olsbury, first assistant at the Sandy Cape Lighthouse, William Lees, the lighthouse's third assistant, along with Mrs. Lees, Donald Henderson, and 2 more witnesses, Jemina and Jessie Olsbury, all confirming they had personally seen the creature making for shore that same day. A separate mark on the same document, attributed to a boy identified in period records only as Robert, indicated he had seen the same creature days earlier, suggesting this was not a single isolated appearance, but a pattern building for at least a week before Lovell's own detailed encounter. What gave the story even more weight at the time was something Lovell herself made clear in her own written account. The creature was not unknown to the Aboriginal people of the region. It already had a name, Moha Moha, translated as dangerous turtle, tied to existing local knowledge, describing an animal known for attacking coastal camps and grabbing people by the leg. Lovell was not inventing a new legend out of nothing. She was describing, in careful, specific written detail, an encounter with something the local community already knew and already feared, long before she ever set foot on that beach. The account moved quickly from a local curiosity into something closer to genuine scientific inquiry. Details of the sighting were published in the British publication Land and Water in January of 1891, drawing the attention of William Saville Kent, a naturalist connected to London's Natural History Museum, who was working extensively across the Great Barrier Reef region at the time. Saville Kent corresponded directly with Lovell, requesting further detail, and ultimately gave the creature a formal, scientific-sounding binomial name, Chelasauria lavelli, publishing it within his own 1893 book on the Great Barrier Reef, treating the sighting seriously enough to grant it the same kind of formal taxonomic naming convention used for genuinely confirmed species. Before we go further, my ebook The Timeline Lie covers 15 more sites like this across the country. Cases built on UINE documentation that quietly never made it into the version of history most of us were taught. For decades, the moha moha sat in cryptozoological literature as one of the more credible sea serpent accounts on record, multiple named witnesses, a formal scientific description, and a pre-existing Aboriginal name and warning that predated the sighting itself. Then, in the mid-20th century, a Belgian zoologist named Bernard Heuvelmans, widely regarded as the founding figure of modern cryptozoology, turned his attention directly to the case, and the resulting takedown was about as thorough as it gets. In his influential book, In the Wake of the Sea Serpents, Heuvelmans subjected Lovell's account to close scientific scrutiny and reached a conclusion that was, by any measure, harsh. He focused specifically on the tail, pointing out that scales described as running perpendicular to the axis of the tail itself represented a genuine physical impossibility for any real swimming animal, since scales oriented that way would work directly against the tail's ability to generate any useful propulsion through water. No known animal, living or extinct, is built that way, for the simple reason that an animal built that way could not actually swim. Heuvelmans did not stop at the biology. He directly attacked Lovell's credibility as a witness, describing her in openly dismissive, personally insulting terms, questioning her competence, her honesty, and even her mental state, going so far as to suggest her own teaching students were poorly served by what he characterised as a confused, unreliable communicator. Later writers examining the case pushed the scepticism even further, with some questioning whether Selena Lovell had existed at all, or whether the entire account, letters, sketches, and signed witness statement included, represented an elaborate hoax constructed by someone using her name. If you are finding this as fascinating as I am, make sure you are subscribed, because the case does not resolve cleanly in either direction. And that unresolved tension is exactly what makes it worth sitting with properly. Heuvelmans built a genuinely strong scientific argument against the physical plausibility of exactly what Lovell described. That argument deserves real weight. A tail built the way she described it could not function as a swimming animal's tail is expected to function. And that is not a matter of opinion. It is basic hydrodynamics. If her description was accurate down to the last physical detail, then whatever she saw was not simply an unusual, unclassified animal. It was something that should not, by any conventional biological logic, have been able to move the way she said it moved. What that argument does not fully explain, however, is everything else surrounding the case. Heuvelmans' critique focused almost entirely on discrediting Lovell personally and picking apart the specific physical mechanics of her description. It offers considerably less explanation for why 6 additional named witnesses, including 2 lighthouse keepers, whose entire professional reputation depended on careful, sober observation, signed their names to a document confirming they had seen the same creature on the same day. It also does not explain why the Aboriginal name and associated warning existed independently of Lovell's account in the first place, a detail that would need to be either coincidental or itself part of an elaborate hoax for Heuvelmann's full dismissal to hold together completely. That gap between a genuinely strong biological objection and a genuinely unexplained pattern of independent witness testimony is where the Moha Moha case has sat, largely undisturbed, for well over a century. No consensus natural explanation has ever successfully replaced it. Nobody has confidently identified a known species, misidentified or otherwise, capable of producing the specific combination of features 7 separate people apparently agreed on that day in June of 1890. The case remains neither confirmed nor cleanly closed. An unusually well-documented sighting sitting permanently in the gap between serious testimony and serious scientific doubt. What makes a case like this different from a typical campfire cryptid story is precisely that level of documentation. This was not a single blurry account passed down secondhand across generations, gradually growing more dramatic with each retelling. It was a formally signed statement, published in a respected scientific publication, examined and named by a credentialed naturalist connected to one of the world's leading natural history institutions, only to be picked apart decades later by the very field of study that had once taken it seriously enough to give it a name at all. Sandy Cape still sits at the northern tip of Kagari today, the same stretch of coastline where Selena Lovell reportedly stood for half an hour, 5 feet from something, with a face she described as reptilian, and teeth she measured at 18 inches. Whatever moved through that water in 1890, whether an elaborate hoax, an honest but flawed description of something considerably more ordinary, or a genuine, undocumented animal briefly observed by 7 people who had no obvious reason to coordinate a lie together, the case has never received the one thing that would finally settle it either way. No second sighting, no physical evidence, no conclusive answer, standing exactly where the last one left off more than a century later. The Moha Moha did not emerge in isolation either. The late 19th century produced a genuine wave of reported sea serpent sightings across multiple continents, a period cryptozoologists sometimes describe as the golden age of sea serpent reports, when improved ocean travel put considerably more trained observers, ship captains, naval officers, lighthouse keepers out on the water and along remote coastlines than at almost any previous point in history. Many of those accounts have since been dismissed as misidentified whales, giant squid, oarfish, or elongated masses of floating kelp catching the light at an unfortunate angle. What sets the Moha Moha apart from the bulk of that broader wave is the sheer level of corroborating detail attached to it. A named, credentialed observer, a formal signed statement from multiple additional witnesses, and immediate serious engagement from an actual working naturalist rather than a second-hand account filtered through newspaper embellishment. That level of documentation is precisely why Heuvelmann's felt compelled to address the case so directly and so aggressively in the first place. A vague third-hand rumour would hardly have warranted the kind of detailed rebuttal he produced. The Moha Moha, by contrast, arrived with enough specific, checkable detail that it demanded a specific, checkable response, and the response Heuvelmann's ultimately delivered focused almost entirely on the one detail he could disprove with confidence: the physically impossible arrangement of the tail scales, while largely sidestepping the considerably harder question of what 7 independent people, several of them professionally responsible for careful observation as part of their actual job, believed they were looking at that day. It is worth being honest about what a story like this can and cannot responsibly claim. Nothing about the Moha Moha case constitutes proof that an undiscovered species of giant marine reptile was living off the Queensland coast in 1890. The physical description, taken at face value, describes an animal that could not function as described, and that detail alone is enough to prevent any responsible researcher from presenting the case as confirmed. What the case does responsibly support is something more modest, and in some ways more genuinely interesting. A documented instance of multiple credible witnesses in a remote, professionally staffed location, independently reporting an encounter with something that has never been adequately explained by any single confidently accepted natural cause. That distinction between proof of an undiscovered creature and proof of a genuinely unresolved historical mystery matters considerably. Cryptid stories are frequently treated as a binary choice. Either the creature was real, or the witnesses were lying, mistaken, or fooled by something mundane. The Moha Moha resists that binary more stubbornly than most. Heuvelmans' specific technical objection to the tale is difficult to argue with on its own terms. The complete absence of any comparably specific explanation for the rest of the sighting, the shape, the behaviour, the pre-existing Aboriginal name, the 6 additional signatures, is equally difficult to simply wave away. Questions about Selena Lovell's own existence and character deserve their own moment of scrutiny too, since Heuvelmans' personal attacks on her have themselves been treated somewhat uncritically by later writers repeating his conclusions. A woman working as a schoolteacher in remote colonial Queensland in 1890 would have been operating in a genuinely isolated professional position, and the specific methodical detail in her account, precise measurements, careful colour description, a documented half-hour observation period reads less like the confused ramblings Heuvelmans characterised, and more like the work of someone deliberately trying to record an unfamiliar event as accurately as her own vocabulary and available reference points allowed. That she reached for comparisons to turtles and serpents, the closest large animals she had any real frame of reference for, says more about the limits of 19th century natural history literacy than it does about her honesty or mental state. What ultimately remains, more than 135 years after that afternoon at Sandy Cape, is a case that refuses the easy resolution most old cryptid stories eventually receive. It was never fully vindicated. It was never fully debunked either, not in the complete sense that phrase usually implies. It sits instead in a considerably rarer category, a sighting detailed enough to name, precise enough to formally critique, and stubborn enough that neither believers nor skeptics have ever managed to close the file completely.